This is the Atari 5200. Released in 1982, it was meant to replace the Atari 2600 in the market. Sadly, it's regarded as the worst game console of all time by many people, mostly due to this controller. The Atari 2600 controller was simply a joystick and one button. 5200, you have this crazy beast with a number pad that looks like it's been ripped off a telephone, 4 different fire buttons, an analog joystick, a start, pause, and reset button, all in a very uncomfortable slab type design. Now, why would Atari design a controller like this for the successor to something as simple as the 2600? Reason is the Intellivision. This crazy contraption was released by Mattel in 1980 to compete with the Atari 2600. If you'll notice, it has 2 fire buttons on each side, so 4 total, a numeric keypad for inputs, and this crazy directional disc for movement, which is also a button. But this features 16 different directions versus the 8 that the standard Atari joystick could take. This system did pretty well against the 2600. It was very good for certain types of games like sports titles, certain adventure games. Not as good for action and platformers, but the controller worked really well because it gave you a lot of options. There'd be an overlay that would slide in. And for like a submarine game, you press 2 to go up surface, 5 to dive, 1 to arm a torpedo, the fire button to do this, 6 to bring up sonar or something. Things like that. But of course, the main sales of the system were due to the sports titles available, which were, for their time, pretty good, especially when compared to those on the 2600. So, by 82, Atari had redesigned the 8-bit computer line, the Atari 400 or 800 computers, sort of compacted the design, took out the keyboard, and come up with this beast. Now, I personally think it's a pretty good console, save for these controllers. And I want to like the controllers, but there's some serious problems with them, which we'll go over. As I said, the analog stick is just that, it's analog, and it's not naturally self-centering. It relies on this rubber bit to sort of put it back in place, but this part wears down over time. In fact, I have one controller where the center ring is just missing. The contacts for the actual buttons are all not much different from a calculator. If you've ever taken apart a cheap, $1 calculator, you'll find this little membrane in there, and these buttons simply have a small conductive piece that bridges the gap in the circuit and sends a signal. Well, everything's made out of subpar materials, so it corrodes basically within hours of being exposed to air. It's like these things came off the factory and automatically started to go bad. So oftentimes people would buy brand new systems and the controllers wouldn't work. If they were disassembled and cleaned, they'd work fine, but this was 1982. Who disassembled and cleaned this stuff regularly? It was new. This thing was, I think, $300 back in 1982 money, so you're not going to sit there and do that. Now, I have a controller that's ready to go to be disassembled, so I guess we'll just move right into that. For comparison's sake, here we have an Intellivision controller next to one of my other very broken Atari 5200 controllers. You'll see once again the near identical number pad, save for star and pound versus clear and enter. Doesn't really matter. The pause button on here, which pause was actually a feature on the Intellivision, where if you hit 7 and 3 or 1 and 9 in the middle of gameplay, the screen would go black and the game would just be waiting. Just still powered on, but it just sit there and wait. It was a pause function, and it was pretty useful for the time. So Atari decided to put that in on the controller and build it into the hardware directly for the 5200, whereas back on the 2600, later games might use the color and black and white switch for that function. The fire buttons are arranged in a slightly different position, which makes it somewhat easier to hit both buttons on the 5200 controller versus the 7800, the Intellivision controller. But it's still awkward because it's the same slab form factor as this, which gets very uncomfortable very quickly. With the 5200, it's at least nice that the analog stick is still a stick, so this hand is mostly free to sort of float there, whereas this one you're jamming in on this crazy disc. Now, I like the Intellivision, and like I said, I like the 5200, but this controller is terrible. That's all there is to it. Let's go on and open it up and see what's inside. This one I have the screws removed because I was trying to repair it and found out the membrane is broken, so it's never going to work right again. First thing that happens as you open it up is that this part has to slide out of here, which it's a pain in the butt to get all this back in. You have to take this part off and it's crazy. But we go on and get the bottom part open. There we go. We have the upper portion, which uses this little sliding mechanism to adjust these potentiometers, variable resistors. Same thing as the 2600 paddle controller or any volume knob you've ever used. They simply rotate, and the system is designed to know what rotation is with what axis and move the cursor, the character, what have you. They have a pretty good range to them, but the 5200 controller, because of this mechanism, when you move, it still is pretty much only moving in sort of a square. So even though you can shift your direction, all kinds of angles, and you have full analog control, it still wasn't quite the same. You still had that limitation. These are the membranes in question. That they don't look bad, but it's extremely thin. Very thin. And it actually just seems to corrode instantly. I've never quite understood it. And here it is for the number pad. And here's the actual number pad inlay, and like I said, just like most of your cheap calculators, you have this little contact which would bridge the gap here. So if you have this over, you'd push the button and it would bridge the gap. And everything lines up fine. It's not like this is off-center in the manufacturing. It was manufactured to quality, standards. Even has these little prongs right here that keep this just perfectly in place. No, the problem very much is that these contacts corrode, and the whole controller uses this. Even the fire buttons use these same kind of contacts, no switches of any kind, giving the whole controller a slightly squishy feel. Even with the analog, that rubber bit just makes it all feel like this, just squishy. And the design is pretty good, save for playing games like Pac-Man or something where to really move you have to throw the controller every which way. It's not pleasant and results in pretty poor control compared to the classic digital stick for the 2600. Fire buttons, like I said, are squishy and awkward. I mean, if you have to press this repeatedly like Missile Command, it wears you out. And the number pad, it serves the same purpose as it did on the Intellivision for additional functions, but most of the games for the system, since it has such a short shelf life, they pretty much use nothing more than like 1-player, 2-player select, easy, medium, hard, or other kind of arrangements on the title screen, and that's about all they did. Most games never actually made use of this. Star Raiders is one of the well-known exceptions, because even on its Atari 2600 release, it had to have a custom keypad like this, accessory built in and sold with it that you had to plug in like you would a paddle controller. The 5200 did, however, not need any paddle controllers because the analog nature of these joysticks meant for games like Kaboom or Missile Command, you wouldn't need a trackball either. It was nice and fluid. So if you shifted just a little bit, the ball would move, or the paddle would move just slightly to the side. If you fling it all the way over, the paddle would move all the way. Missile Command, it controlled how quickly your cursor moved. So for analog games, it was great. For digital controlled games, not so well. So again, games like Missile Command, it's perfect for, but Centipede, it's alright with. But Pac-Man, forget it. It just is a pain to play. It's a serious chore. Still better than Pac-Man on the 2600, but that's not saying much. Honestly, I'd rather just play it on the Commodore computers of the time. That's a pretty good version. That really about sums up this quick teardown and review of the 5200 controller. I like what they were trying to do, but I don't think the controller was really built that well. They basically went very cheap. I've heard that the contacts were originally a different metal, and that in production they were ordered to use the cheaper components to save on costs. That's not to say the same technology wasn't used here in the Intellivision. From what I've heard and seen, its controller is basically a couple of thin membranes, but it still works after 33 years. This, it didn't work right out of the box. I mean, I only have one working controller, which I believe is not this one, but out of 3 controllers, only one doesn't work. These 2 are broken. They don't respond at all to cleaning, and with the working controller, I have to disassemble and clean that every time I want to play the console, because how often do you really play Atari 5200, right? Oh well. Thanks for watching. I'll catch everyone later.